My stepmother and father are going on a honeymoon with their daughters, leaving me alone. So I make sure they don't come back into my house. Okay, so I'm 22 and I own the house I grew up in. It wasn't always mine, though. My mom left it to me when she passed away last year. She had a stroke out of nowhere, and that's still something I'm processing. She was only 47. I mean, it still feels unreal sometimes, you know? One minute she's here and then, boom, she's just gone. But anyway, she left me the house, which is the only good thing that came out of all that, I guess. Growing up, I was close to my mom. My parents split when I was 7, and I did the whole back and forth thing. Half the time with dad, half with mom. But let's be real, I always got along better with her. Dad was just, I don't know. He was always busy. It was either work or some woman he was dating. Honestly, it was like I was never his priority. Not that I'm bitter or anything. Well, maybe a little. But I had mom, so I didn't care that much. When I turned 18 and started college, Dad moved to Chicago for work. So I didn't really see him unless it was Christmas or maybe Thanksgiving if he felt like flying in. It was no big deal to me at the time. I was busy with school anyway. Then, 2 years ago, Dad shows up for Christmas with this woman, Susan. She's 38, so yeah, way younger than him. She's got 2 teenage daughters, Claire and Jessica, who were 16 and 14 at the time. It was a little weird, to be honest. Dad had never brought a girlfriend to any family event before. And suddenly, here's Susan with her kids. I tried to be nice. Like, I wasn't about to make it awkward or anything. Plus, Dad seemed really into her, and her daughters were quiet, keeping to themselves. So, I thought, whatever, right? We had a decent dinner, exchanged presents, all that Christmas stuff. After that, Susan would say hi if I was on the phone with Dad, and she seemed pretty cool. Her daughters, though? Yeah, they stayed quiet, didn't really talk much. I figured they were just shy or something. Then, last year, Mom passed, and I found out she left me the house. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't expecting anything, but I wasn't surprised either. Mom always had things planned, and she knew how much this house meant to me. She even told me around my 18th birthday that she had made sure everything was in order for when she was gone. I thought it was a little morbid at the time, but now I'm glad she did that. So, I moved into the house after graduation. I didn't want to rush into getting an apartment or anything. Plus, this house has always been a place of comfort for me. I thought it'd be nice to live here and figure things out. Dad, though, he was not happy. I didn't know it at first, but he wanted the house back. See, this was the house he bought with my mom when they first got married, and I guess he thought it should have gone to him. He got all moody about it, but he never said it directly. It was more like subtle digs here and there. He didn't have to pay alimony after the divorce, so it's not like he lost out financially or anything, but I could tell it bothered him. After the funeral, Dad and Susan went back to Chicago, and for a while things were quiet. I lived here on my own, settled into a routine, started a new job. You know how it goes. Then, about 6 months ago, Dad calls me and says he's getting married to Susan. They're going to have the wedding in Chicago, but after the wedding, they want to stay here for a bit before they head off on their honeymoon. I didn't think much of it at first. He said it didn't make sense to stay in a hotel when there's this big house with empty rooms, and he promised to cover the bills while they were here, so I figured sure, why not? I let them move in a month before the wedding, and at first, it was kind of nice having people around. The house felt less empty, and Susan was nice enough. Her daughters still didn't talk much, but they weren't causing any problems, so I didn't mind. For the first couple of weeks, everything was chill. We'd eat dinner together, talk about wedding plans, and I was even starting to think, maybe this wouldn't be so bad long term. Then, 3 days before the wedding, Dad sits me down for this serious talk. He asks if I'd be okay with them staying here permanently. Like, he just drops that on me, no warning. He says they've been thinking about it and feel like this house could be a home for all of us. He even says he doesn't like the idea of me living here alone because, apparently, he's worried about me or something. I don't know where that concern was when he was busy with work or off dating random women while I was growing up, but suddenly, now he's concerned. I didn't say yes right away. I mean, it was flattering that he wanted me to feel like part of the family, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the thought of how pissed he was when he found out he wasn't getting the house. So, instead of agreeing, I told him I needed to think about it and that I'd give him an answer after the wedding. He seemed a little disappointed, but he didn't push it, which was good because I wasn't ready to make a decision yet. Anyway, the wedding comes and goes, and it was fine. They had a small ceremony, and I was getting ready to tell Dad my decision. I figured I'd say no, but I wanted to wait until they were done celebrating. 2 days after the wedding, I wake up, and the house is dead silent. Everyone's gone. At first, I thought maybe they went out for breakfast or something, but then I noticed most of their stuff was still here, Suitcases, clothes, everything. I start calling Dad. No answer. I try Susan, and she finally picks up, all casual, like nothing's wrong. She tells me they left for their honeymoon that morning and would be gone for a week. Like, what? They didn't even tell me they were leaving. I was living in this house with them, and they just dipped without saying a word. I'm already annoyed, but then Susan starts acting all weird. She's like, "Oh, don't worry, we'll be back soon. But hey, could you make sure the house is clean for when we return?" I almost lost it right there. Here I am, letting them stay in my house, and she's acting like it's her place. I tried to stay calm, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just that they didn't tell me. They were treating me like some kind of maid. So yeah, that's when I knew things were about to change. All right, so after that whole honeymoon stunt, I was done. Like, completely over it. They left without a word, treated me like I was their maid, and then Susan had the nerve to boss me around about cleaning the house. Yeah, no thanks. I had already been on the fence about them staying long term, but now? Not happening. The second she hung up the phone, I knew exactly what I was going to do. First thing I did was pack up their stuff. And when I say pack, I don't mean I folded everything neatly and put it in boxes. Nope. I grabbed all their clothes, shoes, whatever else they had lying around, and just tossed it into these old, beat-up cardboard boxes I found in the garage. I didn't care how wrinkled or messed up their things got. I just wanted it all out of my sight. It felt like I was taking back my space, you know? This is my house, and if they're going to disrespect me like that, they don't deserve to stay here. After I packed their things, I dragged the boxes out to the front yard. I know it sounds petty, but at that point, I didn't care. I was so angry that I wanted them to come home and find their stuff sitting outside like garbage. They needed to understand that they couldn't just treat me like an afterthought in my own home. Once the boxes were out, I wasn't done. I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for the front and back doors. Changing the locks wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, though. I had no clue what I was doing, so I watched a YouTube video on how to change them, and it took me a solid couple of hours to figure it out. But once I got them installed, I felt a weird sense of satisfaction. Like this was me taking control of my own space again. It felt good. A week later, they finally came back from their honeymoon. I knew the moment they'd come home because Dad started blowing up my phone. I was at work, so I didn't answer right away, but I knew exactly what he was calling about. By the time I checked my phone on break, I had about 15 missed calls from him and a few text messages. The texts were short and to the point. Where are our things? Why are the locks changed? Call me now. I ignored them. I wasn't in the mood to deal with their tantrums, especially not while I was trying to focus on work. But I figured it would only get worse if I didn't respond, so when I got home, I called Dad back. I expected him to be angry, but I wasn't ready for just how furious he was. He didn't even give me a chance to say hello before he launched into a full-on rant. He was shouting about how I was disrespectful and ungrateful, and how this wasn't how family treated each other. I let him go on for a bit, just listening. But the whole time I was sitting there thinking, where was all this family talk when you ditched me to go on a honeymoon? Eventually, he paused to take a breath, and I cut in. I told him straight up, you don't live here. You don't get to make the rules. I reminded him that it's my house now, not his. He went silent for a second, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. I think he was shocked that I actually stood up to him. Then he tried to guilt trip me. He said something like, your mother would be so disappointed in you for treating me like this, she would want us to live together as a family. That hit a nerve, but I wasn't going to let him manipulate me. I knew exactly what Mom would have wanted, and it wasn't for me to let Dad and his new family waltz in and take over my life. So I told him that. I told him Mom left the house to me for a reason, and if he thought for 1 second that she'd want him and Susan living here after what they'd done, he was delusional. That's when the conversation really took a turn. He started yelling again, calling me selfish and immature. He said I was acting like a spoiled brat and that I needed to grow up. But here's the thing. I was the one who had been responsible this whole time. I'd been living on my own, paying my bills, taking care of the house. Meanwhile, he's out here acting like it's still 1995 and he can just waltz back into my life whenever he feels like it. So I told him, if you want your stuff, take it from the front yard. If I see you or Susan or anyone else in this house when I get back, I'm calling the cops. That shut him up real quick. He hung up on me after that, and I wasn't sure if he'd actually take the stuff or just leave it there as some sort of passive-aggressive move. But when I got home from work later, the boxes were gone. I felt this huge sense of relief, like I had finally put my foot down and made it clear that I wasn't going to be pushed around. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. The next day, Dad calls me again. This time, he's not yelling, but he's trying to act all calm and rational, like he didn't just flip out on me the day before. He tells me that Susan wants to apologize. Apparently, she didn't mean any of the things she said and was just having a bad day. Yeah, right. I wasn't buying it for a second. I let him talk for a while just to see where this was going, and then he dropped the real reason for the call. They were broke. Turns out Dad had been fired from his job months ago and had been living off his savings. They spent all their money on this extravagant wedding and honeymoon, and now they were pretty much homeless. He actually had the nerve to ask me if they could move back in just for a little while until they got back on their feet. I almost laughed. They expected me to let them back into my house after everything? Not a chance. I told Dad no, flat out. I said they could figure it out on their own, but they weren't coming back here. I reminded him that they treated me like crap, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into feeling sorry for them. He tried one last guilt trip, saying, "You're my daughter. I thought you'd be there for me." But I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. I told him I was done and hung up the phone. And that's where things stood. I was free of them, or so I thought. All right, so after telling my dad they couldn't move back in, I thought that was the end of it. Like, seriously, I figured they'd go find a place, deal with their mess, and leave me alone, but nope, that's not what happened. The next few days were, well, they were a train wreck. It started with a text. Actually, it was like 3 texts, all from my dad, one after the other. Something along the lines of, "Please reconsider. You don't understand the situation, and we really need your help." I didn't answer because at that point, I was just over it. I had said my piece, and I didn't want to deal with their guilt trips anymore. But that's when things started to get weird. One afternoon, I'm at work, and my phone starts blowing up. Not just texts, but phone calls too. And not from Dad this time. Susan was calling. Now, I'm not stupid, I knew what was coming, but I figured I'd let her speak her mind and get it over with. So I picked up. Big mistake. She starts off all sweet, like she didn't call me a selfish brat the last time we talked. She's going on and on about how much they miss me, how they don't want this rift between us, and how the girls, Claire and Jessica, really want to come back and live as a family. I didn't say anything at first, just let her ramble because I knew she wasn't calling just to catch up. She was building up to something, and when she finally got to it, it was worse than I expected. Turns out, they didn't just want to move back in. No, they needed to move back in. Why? Because they had no other options. Dad had lost his job months ago, something he conveniently forgot to mention when they first asked to stay. Not only that, but they had spent all their savings on this ridiculous, over-the-top wedding and the honeymoon. Susan wasn't working because, get this, she quit her job to become a full-time housewife right after the wedding. Now with no income, they couldn't afford their rent back in Chicago, so they were essentially homeless. I was fuming. I mean, who quits their job with no backup plan? And how do you spend all your money on a wedding when you don't even have a job? It made no sense. So I told her flat out, "I'm not your safety net. You can't just show up here and expect me to bail you out." That's when her sweet act dropped. In the blink of an eye, she went from, "Oh, we miss you so much," to, "You're heartless." She actually had the audacity to call me selfish for not letting them move back in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She said something like, "We're your family, and family is supposed to help each other out in times of need." I cut her off right there. I wasn't about to sit through another guilt trip. I told her that I had already helped them by letting them stay before the wedding, and that's where my obligation ended. Then she hit me with, "If your mother were here, she'd be so disappointed in you." That was the last straw. I told her I wasn't going to let her use my mom's memory against me like that and hung up. She tried calling back a few more times, but I ignored it. At that point, I wasn't sure what their next move would be, but I knew they weren't giving up without a fight. The next day, Dad showed up at my house. No warning, no text. He just knocked on the door like everything was fine. I wasn't home when he first came by, but one of my neighbors texted me to say they saw him hanging around outside. Great. So I got home after work, half expecting him to still be there, but he wasn't. I thought maybe he'd finally taken the hint, but then I saw the note he left on my front door. The note was just as you'd expect. More guilt trips, more pleas for help. But there was one part that stood out. He mentioned that if I didn't let them move back in, they were going to lose everything. He wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about their entire life in Chicago. They had been evicted from their apartment, and their only option was to move back to their hometown, which apparently was the last thing they wanted to do. I'll admit, part of me felt bad. Like, I didn't want them to lose everything. But at the same time, I knew this wasn't my fault. They put themselves in this situation. Dad losing his job wasn't on me. Susan quitting hers definitely wasn't on me. And spending all their money on a wedding? Yeah, that was their bad decision, not mine. I wasn't about to let them make it my responsibility. That night, Dad called again, and this time I picked up. I figured we needed to have one final conversation, lay everything out on the table, and then hopefully, that would be the end of it. The call started off with Dad trying to be calm and reasonable. He explained everything, how he had been laid off months before the wedding but didn't want to worry me with the details. He said he thought he'd get another job quickly, but with the economy being what it was, that didn't happen. Susan quitting her job was a mutual decision because they thought it'd be better for the family. And the money? Well, they thought they'd have enough saved up to cover everything. I let him talk, but when he finished, I didn't hold back. I told him I didn't appreciate being lied to, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into feeling sorry for them. I said it plain and simple. You're adults. You made these choices. Now you have to deal with the consequences. He tried one last time to guilt trip me, saying things like, "We're your family, and I just want to live somewhere that reminds me of your mother." But I wasn't falling for it. I told him I was done, I wasn't letting them back in, and that was final. Dad got quiet after that. I thought maybe he'd hang up, but instead he started crying, like actual sobbing. He told me that I was breaking his heart, that he couldn't believe I was turning my back on him in his time of need. I'll be honest, it was tough hearing him like that. Part of me wanted to cave, to tell him they could stay just so the guilt would go away. But I knew that if I gave in now, it would never end. They'd keep taking, and I'd never have any peace in my own home. So I told him, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." He didn't say anything after that, just hung up. So, after that last call where Dad broke down crying, I figured that was it. He hung up, I stuck to my guns, and they'd finally leave me alone, right? Nope, I should have known better. If anything, things were just getting started. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet, honestly. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know? And of course it did. It started with a text from Susan. Now, keep in mind, I had already blocked her number, but apparently she found another way to reach me. She used Claire's phone to text me, trying to act all casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, just wanted to let you know we're heading back to Chicago. Hope you're doing well." It was bizarre, like she was pretending the last few weeks of drama didn't exist. I didn't respond, because at this point, I wasn't going to engage. But something about the way she worded it didn't sit right with me. Heading back to Chicago? How? They didn't have a place to live or any money. Later that day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I figured it was some random telemarketer, but nope, it was Dad. I didn't know it was him until I picked up and heard his voice. He wasn't yelling this time. Actually, he sounded weirdly calm, which instantly made me suspicious. He said, "I need to talk to you. Can we meet in person?" I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of seeing him face to face after everything that had gone down, but at the same time, I wanted to get it over with. So I agreed. We set up a time to meet at a coffee shop near my place. When I got there, he was already sitting at a table, looking tired as hell. I mean, bags under his eyes, hair all messed up. He didn't look good. I sat down, and we had this super awkward silence for a minute. Then he starts telling me how they've been trying to figure things out since I told them they couldn't move back in. He mentioned staying with a friend for a couple of days, but apparently, that didn't work out. That's when he drops the real news. They're not going back to Chicago. Now, remember Susan's text about heading back? Yeah, that was a lie. Turns out they're moving in with someone else. And this is where things took a turn I didn't see coming. Susan's ex-boyfriend, Kyle, had offered to take them in. Let me tell you, my jaw practically hit the floor. Kyle, as in the guy she dated before Dad, the one she supposedly had this messy breakup with? I couldn't believe it. Dad tried to explain it like it was no big deal. He said Kyle had seen their situation and felt bad, so he offered to let them stay with him and help them get back on their feet. But come on, who does that? It was obvious there was more going on here. I asked Dad straight up, "Are you seriously okay with this? Like, how could he be fine with his new wife moving back in with her ex?" He shrugged and said they didn't have many options. They were desperate, and Kyle was the only one willing to help. He even tried to convince me it was just temporary, but I wasn't buying it. As if things weren't awkward enough, Dad then casually mentioned that Kyle had been spending a lot of time with Claire and Jessica. He said it like it was no big deal, but I could tell there was more to the story. Apparently, Kyle had missed out on a lot of their lives when they were younger, like he wasn't around much when they were growing up. So now, he was trying to make up for lost time or whatever. And that's when it hit me. This whole thing was a mess, and Dad was just too blind to see it. I tried to reason with him. I told him that moving in with Kyle wasn't going to end well. I mean, it was a disaster waiting to happen. But he wouldn't listen. He just kept saying, it's only temporary, and we'll figure it out. At this point, I was losing my patience. I didn't want to be part of their drama anymore. I was ready to leave when Dad suddenly said something that made me freeze. He told me that if things didn't work out with Kyle, they were still hoping I'd reconsider letting them move back in with me. Are you kidding me? After everything that had happened, he was still trying to guilt trip me into taking them in? I couldn't believe it. I stood up right there and told him I wasn't changing my mind. I said, "You've made your choice, and now you have to live with it." As I was about to walk out, Dad grabbed my arm, not in a forceful way, but just enough to make me stop. He looked at me with this sad, desperate expression and said, "I don't want to lose you too." That hit me harder than I expected. Part of me felt bad for him, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't let him drag me into their mess again. I pulled my arm away and told him, "You've already lost me." And with that, I left. The next few days were a blur. I kept replaying that conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Part of me felt like I'd been too harsh, but the other part knew I was doing the right thing. Then, about a week later, I got another call, this time from Claire. I hadn't heard from her in ages, so I was curious why she was calling. She sounded nervous, almost like she didn't want to be on the phone. She told me that Kyle had been acting weird around her and Jessica since they moved in. Now, I'm not going to get into too many details, but let's just say the vibe was off. Claire didn't say much, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. She asked if there was any way they could come stay with me for a little while, just until things settled down. That threw me for a loop. Here I was thinking I was done with their drama, and now Claire was reaching out to me for help. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to help her, but another part of me didn't want to get dragged back into their mess. So I told her I'd think about it and get back to her. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just leave her and Jessica in a bad situation. I started to wonder if maybe this whole thing was bigger than I realized. So after that call from Claire, I was torn. Part of me didn't want to deal with their drama anymore. I had finally gotten rid of Dad, Susan, and all the craziness that came with them. But hearing the fear in Claire's voice made me feel like maybe I couldn't just ignore what was happening. I mean, she's a kid. Well, not exactly. She's 17 now, but still. She sounded scared, and I couldn't just brush that off. I told myself I'd sleep on it and figure things out in the morning, but let's be real. I barely got any sleep that night. My mind was racing, thinking about what Claire said, wondering what was going on in that house. The fact that she called me of all people meant it had to be serious. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself that this wasn't my problem. But, deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I called Claire back. She picked up almost immediately, like she'd been waiting for my call. I didn't waste any time. I asked her straight up, "What's going on with Kyle? Why are you and Jessica so uncomfortable?" She hesitated, which didn't exactly make me feel better. Finally, she said, "It's just, he's been acting weird, like he's always around, always watching us." That sent a chill down my spine. I asked her if he'd done anything specific, but she said no, not really. It was more of a feeling. You know that gut feeling you get when something's off? She said he kept trying to get closer to them, like constantly offering to take them places or insisting they hang out with him. She didn't like it, and Jessica didn't either. But every time they mentioned it to Susan, she just brushed it off like it was no big deal. At this point, I was starting to panic a little. I mean, I don't know Kyle that well, but something about this situation screamed red flag. I didn't want to freak Claire out even more, but I knew I had to do something. So I asked her if she and Jessica wanted to stay with me for a few days, just to get away and clear their heads. She jumped at the chance. It was like she'd been waiting for someone to give her an escape. The next problem was figuring out how to get them out of there without causing a scene. I didn't want to deal with Kyle or Susan, especially not Kyle. I had no idea how he'd react if he found out the girls were leaving. And honestly, I didn't want to find out. Claire said Kyle worked late most nights so they could sneak out after he left. They'd pack up some stuff and call me when they were ready. So that night, I waited. It felt like I was sitting on pins and needles, just waiting for something to go wrong. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Finally, around 10 p.m., Claire texted me. "We're ready. Can you come get us?" I grabbed my keys and headed over. When I pulled up to the house, I kept the car running. I didn't want to risk anything. Claire and Jessica came out quietly, both carrying duffel bags. They looked tense, like they were expecting Kyle to come storming out after them at any moment. But he didn't. They got in the car, and we took off. The ride back to my place was pretty quiet. I could tell they were both shaken up, especially Claire. I didn't push them to talk. I figured they needed some time to process everything. When we got back to my house, I set them up in the guest room and told them to make themselves comfortable. They didn't say much, just mumbled thanks and went to bed. The next morning, things were still pretty tense. Claire was on edge, constantly checking her phone. I asked her if she had heard from Susan, and she shook her head. She's probably too busy with Kyle to even notice we're gone, she said bitterly. That hit me hard. Claire was obviously feeling abandoned by her mom, and I couldn't blame her. Later that day, I finally got a call. From Dad. Not Susan, not Kyle, but Dad. I should have seen it coming, but I wasn't exactly prepared for what he had to say. He knew the girls were with me, and he wasn't happy about it. He tried to stay calm, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. He started off by saying, "You should have told me before you took them, like I had kidnapped them or something." I cut him off. "They called me, Dad. They wanted to leave. Something's not right over there, and you know it." That's when the conversation got ugly. He started defending Kyle, saying he was just trying to be a good stepdad, and that Claire and Jessica were being dramatic. He claimed I was stirring the pot and making things worse by letting them stay with me. He even accused me of trying to drive a wedge between him and Susan. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him flat out, "This has nothing to do with you and Susan. I'm just trying to help Claire and Jessica. If you actually listened to them instead of brushing off their concerns, maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation." He didn't like that. He started ranting about how I was overreacting, that Kyle was a good guy, and that I needed to stop causing problems. But I wasn't backing down. I told him I wasn't going to send Claire and Jessica back to a place where they didn't feel safe. And if he had a problem with that, then too bad. That's when he pulled out the big guns. He said, "If you don't send them back, I'll take legal action." I couldn't believe it. My own dad was threatening me with legal action over this? I didn't even know what to say. I just stood there holding the phone, trying to process the fact that this was really happening. After a long silence, I finally said, "Do whatever you need to do, but I'm not sending them back." He hung up after that, and I stood there staring at my phone, wondering how things had gotten so messed up. I mean, this was my dad, and now we were on opposite sides of a battle I didn't even want to be in. Claire and Jessica stayed with me for a while after that. I didn't hear from Susan or Kyle directly, but I knew they were out there trying to figure out their next move. As for Dad, I haven't spoken to him since that call. Maybe he'll follow through with his threat, or maybe he'll realize I was just trying to protect his stepdaughters. I don't know. But one thing's for sure, I'm not backing down.